Okay, the timeline. The first ECC meeting, the ECC was established very late under the law, was on the 26th of April, 2009, and the challenge period for candidates was from the 16th to the 21st of May. There were 302 challenges to candidacy, and 57 nominations were rejected, 3 for presidential and 54 provincial council. Most were because the candidates in question, or the prospective candidates in question, had illegal ties to armed groups. It is illegal under the election law for candidates to command or be members of an unofficial military force or group. Unfortunately, I don't think they weeded out everyone, but there is a list that was developed of those that were suspected or proven to have been members or commanders in illegal military groups. And that list was used to reject the candidacy of several people. During the campaign period, there were 467 complaints received. 249 were adjudicated. 49 of those were, in fact, resulting in sanctions. 200 were dismissed. And very sadly, the 218 were not handled. This was due to lack of staff by the ECC and lack of resources, et cetera. So there were 218 complaints that were just left alone during the campaign period due to lack of resources. And most of the 49 sanctions resulted in misuse of government resources and or untimely campaign finance reports. And an example of misuse of government resources was somebody who used a Ministry of Defense helicopter to go around to different provinces and campaign. There's just a little photo. I tried to throw some photos in so, they don't necessarily have something to do with everything. But this is a campaign poster for Mr. Karzai, a billboard in Kabul, and it shows him waving. On the left here, you can see this is the symbol of his party. Since a great deal of the population in Afghanistan are illiterate, there is a very heavy reliance on colors and symbols on ballots. On the 15th of August, there was a very large coordinated attack against ISAF, which is basically the NATO force in Afghanistan. ISAF stands for the International Security Assistance Force, but that's basically the foreign military operation in Afghanistan is called ISAF. And there was a very serious attack on the 15th of August, and those claiming responsibility for the attack said it was because they were attacking those that had provided material support for the election process. So that was just in the lead up to the 20th of August polling day. On the 20th of August, ISAF reported more than 400 individual security incidents. That's the greatest single number on a single day for a 7-year period. So obviously the election itself was a great catalyst for violence and a very sadly difficult process. 11 IEC workers were murdered on Election Day. Dozens of others were threatened, and many were kidnapped, but subsequently released. This was just a concerted attempt to disrupt the process. In situations where the election workers were kidnapped, it was typical that the election workers would be taken, the ballots would be stolen, and then the ballot boxes stuffed, and the election workers in those cases were thankfully at least released. But that's another reason why you end up with ballot boxes that have 1,000 votes when it's only possible to have 600. The security situation prevented an unknown number of polls from opening. Many of the election workers who were intimidated into not performing their duties did not tell anyone that was the case. They were frightened and therefore didn't say that the ballots had been stolen. So estimates range. The IEC said that several hundred polling places didn't open. ISAF thinks that it's somewhere closer to 1,000, but it could be more, could be less. The point is that there were an extraordinary number of polling centers, polling stations, and ballots that just really weren't accounted for on Election Day. Confusion over the polls that didn't open led to a loss of ballot control, and it also led to allegations of ghost polling stations where we saw lots of results, but we had individual witness accounts saying that those polling stations did not open, or that they were moved from the village where they were supposed to be held to the provincial capital, and that the governor and anyone else were stuffing ballots instead of allowing them to be voted in the polling stations in the province. The poor security situation led to extremely low turnout, and especially in areas where the security situation was worse, then turnout was extremely low. But we had a lot of reports. ISAF was able to give us statistics on the number of rockets that exploded in particular areas. And so when you know that there were rockets basically every 20 minutes all day long, people were staying in their homes, and then you see a result of 700 votes for a certain candidate, you know that those results are questionable at best, if not worse than that. Election observation. One of the big problems was that the security situation prevented a good deal of election observation. So independent monitoring and independent verification of what was going on was non-existent in a majority of the polling centers and polling stations. Domestic observer groups, there were 21 total. However, of the 9,228 accredited observers, over 7,000 of those were from FIFA, which is the Free and Fair Election Federation of Afghanistan. And FIFA is by far the largest observer group, and FIFA did do, in a lot of ways, a very good job of trying to put out reports and trying to talk to people in a way that we, certainly as foreign technical advisors, could not, and they were able to go to places that we could not. However, the candidates and political parties specifically accused FIFA in a lot of cases of having improper ties to different candidates and groups. International observers were pretty much non-existent. The EU, the OSCE, other organizations like Democracy International in the United States and the Canadian government, the British government, other people had an attempt to have election advisors and election monitors throughout the country, but the security situation prevented it in most places. So for the most part, there was no international observers in any place throughout the country. There was a significant presence in Kabul, but virtually not any presence elsewhere. I was actually in Paktika province, and I'll mention that in a little bit, but I talked to the U.S. Army folks who were there, and they said that the observer group that they were with was able to see two polling places before a series of bombings forced them to go back to the base. So they saw two polling places, and that was it. Another thing, there was great confusion about the election process itself. At 4:10, polls were supposed to close at 4 o'clock. At 4:10, the IEC made an announcement that there should be an additional hour of polling. That announcement was not made in a way that actually got to people. So there was an enormous amount of confusion when the media was saying that everybody had another hour to vote, and they arrived and people were already counting ballots, or ballot boxes had been sealed and taken away, or whatever. But that getting that order out, and even in an election in a developed country like the United States, if a court orders more voting, that's a very difficult fact to convey to the polling places, and certainly in a way that's applied consistently and fairly. Counting began after the close of polls, and the IEC reported that 90% of the count had been completed by 5 p.m. on the day following the election. Documents were transferred to Kabul. The ballots were actually kept in the provincial centers, and the ballots themselves were sealed in boxes and kept in the provincial locations, but the results were transferred in tamper-evident bags to Kabul. Unfortunately, many took more than a week to arrive, which also led to questions as to basically where they had been and why it took a long time for them to get there. The Australian government provided an enormous amount of support for the transportation of ballots, and most of the ballots came on Australian planes from the provinces. Election complaint processing. This is what we were doing. The ECC really kicked into high gear at that point. We received 2,854 complaints that were considered timely filed. The complaints were categorized as A, B, or C. We took a triage approach. We said complaints that were listed as A's were ones that could have a material effect on the actual vote totals and the outcome of the election. So those were the ones that we dealt with first. The B complaints dealt with things like poll worker improprieties, but didn't rise to the level of affecting the outcome. And C complaints were those that were either lacking in any sort of witnesses or just, a simple allegation that couldn't in any way be proven, or back to my goat story, things that just had nothing to do with the election and therefore wasn't the ECC's responsibility or within the ECC's ability to deal with them. So 604 of the 2854 were categorized as A complaints. 39% of the total number involved allegations of polling irregularities. 29.6 involved allegations of undue influence, and 11.4 involved access to polling stations.